Commander Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the massive colony ship New Dawn and watched Earth grow smaller in the view screen. His hands gripped the metal railing as the blue marble that had been humanity's home for millions of years became just another dot of light among the stars. Around him, the bridge crew worked quietly at their stations, checking systems and monitoring the fleet's progress into deep space. The evacuation had taken exactly 72 hours. Jake still couldn't believe they had pulled it off. Every human settlement, every orbital station, every mining outpost across 47 star systems had been emptied in perfect coordination. The planning had taken 3 years, but the execution was flawless. Dr. Lisa Carter appeared beside him, her tablet showing the final evacuation reports. She was the fleet's chief scientist and had been one of the main architects of Operation Quiet Storm. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes showed the exhaustion they all felt after 3 days of constant work. "The last transport cleared the outer detection grid 12 minutes ago," she said quietly. "Every human being in occupied space is now aboard the fleet ships." Jake nodded and looked at the numbers on her screen. 2 billion people evacuated, without a single casualty. It should have been impossible, but humanity had managed to do the impossible before. The Zephyrian Alliance had occupied Earth and the human colonies for 3 years, believing they had conquered a primitive species that barely had faster-than-light travel. They had no idea what humans were really capable of when they worked together. Captain Roy Mitchell joined them at the observation deck. He commanded one of the escort vessels and had just returned from the perimeter patrol. His weathered face showed relief as he reported that all ships were clear of alien sensors. Roy had been in the military for 20 years and had seen humanity at its worst during the early days of the occupation. Now he was seeing them at their best. "The automated systems are still running perfectly," Roy said. "Earth looks exactly the same as it did yesterday. The cities are still lit, the orbital platforms are still functioning, and all the industrial complexes are operating normally. The aliens think we're still down there going about our daily lives." That had been the most brilliant part of the plan. Humanity hadn't just run away. They had left behind a perfect illusion. Every major city, every important facility, every sign of human civilization continued to function exactly as before. Advanced computer systems maintained the appearance of a populated world, while the real population silently slipped away into the darkness between stars. Jake walked to the communication station where Lieutenant Danny Walsh was monitoring alien transmissions. Danny was young, barely 25, but he had a gift for languages and had learned to understand Zephyrian communications during the occupation. His job was to make sure the aliens suspected nothing. "What are they saying?" Jake asked. Danny adjusted his headphones and smiled. "The same thing they've been saying for 3 years. They're congratulating themselves on their bloodless conquest and discussing how to best manage their new human subjects. Commander Kethvar just filed a report saying the humans are adapting well to their new government and showing no signs of resistance." If only they knew, Jake thought. The Zephyrians were a cautious species, methodical and careful in everything. They did. They had taken 3 years to fully establish their control over human space, setting up administrative centers, installing monitoring systems, and cataloging everything they considered valuable. They moved slowly because they wanted to avoid any mistakes that might cause problems later. That caution had given humanity time to prepare. While the aliens were busy organizing their new empire, human engineers and scientists had been working on something much more ambitious than simple resistance. They had been planning the greatest disappearing act in galactic history. Admiral Kate Williams appeared on the main view screen from her flagship Human Resolve. She was the overall commander of the evacuation fleet and had been the one to approve the final timeline. Her gray hair and stern expression made her look like someone who had seen too many battles, but her voice carried confidence and authority. "All ships report successful departure from occupied space," she announced to the bridge crew. Phase 1 of Operation Quiet Storm is complete. We now begin the journey to our new home in the Kepler sector. Estimated travel time is 14 months, using our current propulsion systems. Jake felt a mixture of pride and sadness as he listened to the Admiral's words. They had done it. Humanity had successfully evacuated an entire interstellar civilization without the occupying force noticing. But they had also abandoned their homes, their history, and everything they had built over centuries of expansion into space. Dr. Carter seemed to read his thoughts. "We're not abandoning anything permanently," she said softly. "This is just the first phase. We'll be back." She was right. The evacuation was only the beginning of a much larger plan. While the Zephyrians celebrated their victory over humanity, the real humans would be building something new in the empty regions beyond explored space. New ships, new weapons, new technologies, and most importantly, new strategies for dealing with species that thought they could simply take what belonged to others. Jake looked at the tactical display showing the position of all fleet ships. 1,500 vessels of various sizes, from massive colony ships like New Dawn to small escort fighters, all moving in perfect formation toward their destination. Each ship carried not just people and supplies, but pieces of human civilization that would be used to rebuild everything they had lost. Engineer Steve Parker appeared on the bridge carrying a status report. He was responsible for the industrial ships that carried the factories, power plants, and manufacturing equipment needed to establish new colonies. His report showed that everything was functioning normally, and that construction could begin as soon as they reached their destination. "The automated shipyards are already producing new vessels," Steve said. "By the time we reach Kepler, we'll have doubled our fleet size. The aliens left us plenty of raw materials in the asteroid belts they didn't bother to guard." That was another advantage of the Zephyrian approach. They focused on controlling populated worlds and ignored the resource-rich, but empty regions of space. Humanity had quietly been mining those regions for months, stockpiling everything they would need for their new home and their eventual return. As Earth finally disappeared from the view screen, Jake felt a moment of doubt. What if the plan failed? What if the aliens discovered the deception? What if humanity couldn't rebuild fast enough to make a difference? Then he looked around the bridge at his crew and saw the same determination he felt in his own heart. They had pulled off the impossible once. They could do it again. The Zephyrians had made the mistake of underestimating humanity, and they were about to learn just how big that mistake really was. Lieutenant Ben Foster floated in the cramped observation pod of the stealth ship Silent Observer, watching the Zephyrian transport vessels move between Earth and the Moon through his high-powered telescope. 6 months had passed since the great evacuation, and his job was to stay hidden in the asteroid belt and document everything the aliens did in what used to be human space. It was lonely work, but someone had to keep an eye on the enemy. The aliens had settled into human cities like they were moving into abandoned houses. Ben watched them through his instruments as they walked the streets of New York, London, and Tokyo, marveling at human architecture and technology. They treated everything like it was some kind of museum, carefully cataloging human art, human books, and human inventions as if they were studying an extinct civilization. Ben recorded everything. He saw and transmitted encrypted reports back to the hidden human fleet once every week. The Zephyrians had no idea they were being watched. Their ships moved in predictable patterns, their security was minimal, and they seemed completely convinced that they were the only intelligent species in the solar system. Dr. Amy Rodriguez received Ben's latest transmission aboard the research vessel New Horizon, which was traveling with the main fleet toward their new home in the Kepler sector. She was the fleet's lead xenobiologist and had spent years studying Zephyrian behavior and psychology. Ben's reports confirmed everything she had predicted about how the aliens would react to their supposed conquest. The Zephyrians were methodical, creatures who valued order and control above everything else. They had established administrative centers in major human cities, set up communication networks between the occupied worlds, and begun the slow process of integrating human technology into their own systems. They moved carefully and deliberately, making sure every step was properly documented and approved by their superiors. What they couldn't understand was why humans had built so many empty buildings. Ben's observations showed Zephyrian survey teams moving through residential areas, counting houses and apartments, and filing reports about the strange human tendency to construct far more living space than they actually needed. The aliens had no concept of urban sprawl, suburban development, or the human habit of building for future growth rather than current needs. Steve Parker was working in the manufacturing bay of the colony ship Industrial Hope when Amy's latest analysis arrived. He read through her report while supervising the construction of new weapon platforms that would be needed for the eventual return to Earth. Steve's wife, Maria, was coordinating resource allocation between the different ships in the fleet, making sure that everyone had what they needed for the long journey ahead. The children in the fleet kept asking when they were going home, but the adults knew better. They weren't going home in any traditional sense. They were building something new, something better, and preparing to take back what had been stolen from them. Steve's 10-year-old son, Kevin, had been born on Mars and barely remembered Earth, but he understood that the family was part of something important. Amy's reports painted a picture of aliens who were completely out of their depth. The Zephyrians had conquered human space because they wanted the territory and the resources, but they had never planned on actually living in human cities or using human technology. They were like people who had bought a house without understanding how the plumbing worked. Ben watched through his telescope as Zephyrian engineers tried to figure out why human power plants were so complicated. The aliens had their own energy, technology that was more advanced than anything humans had developed, but human systems were designed differently. Human engineers had built redundancy into everything, with backup systems for the backup systems, because humans understood that things could go wrong at the worst possible moment. The Zephyrians built things to work perfectly the first time and never break down. When human systems required maintenance or showed signs of wear, the aliens became confused and frustrated. They kept filing reports about the inferior quality of human engineering without understanding that human systems were designed to be repaired and upgraded over time. Dr. Amy Rodriguez smiled as she read Ben's latest observations. The aliens were starting to get irritated with their prize conquest. Human cities required constant maintenance that the Zephyrians didn't know how to provide. Human transportation systems needed fuel and spare parts that the aliens couldn't manufacture. Human communication networks used frequencies and protocols that didn't match Zephyrian technology. The most amusing part was watching the aliens try to understand human entertainment. Ben's reports described Zephyrian researchers studying human movies, music, and literature, trying to figure out why humans created so much content that served no practical purpose. The aliens had art, but their art was formal and ceremonial. They couldn't comprehend why humans made thousands of different songs about love, loss, and rebellion. Maria Parker received a message from her sister, Rosa, who was aboard the medical ship Healing Hand with her family. Rosa reported that morale in the fleet was holding steady, despite the long journey and uncertain future. People were adapting to life aboard the ships. Children were attending classes in improvised classrooms, and everyone was contributing to the work of building their new civilization. The fleet had grown during the journey as the automated shipyards churned out new vessels using materials mined from asteroids along their route. What had started as 1,500 ships had become over 2,000, and more were being completed every month. Each new ship meant more living space, more manufacturing capacity, and more firepower for whatever lay ahead. Ben Foster checked his instruments and saw something that made him smile. A Zephyrian inspection team was standing in the middle of Times Square, looking completely lost as they tried to figure out why humans had built so many restaurants in one place. The aliens ate for nutrition and social bonding, but the concept of choosing between hundreds of different food options was beyond their comprehension. He added the observation to his daily report and transmitted it back to the fleet. Dr. Rodriguez would find it interesting from a cultural perspective, and Admiral Williams would want to know that the aliens were still struggling to understand basic human behavior 6 months after their supposed victory. The Zephyrians thought they had won a war, but they were actually just house-sitting for a species that would eventually return to reclaim everything they had left behind. Ben settled back into his observation chair and continued watching the greatest comedy show in the galaxy as the aliens tried to figure out how to live like humans, without understanding what made humans human. Zephyrian Administrator Keth Var stood in his office on the 50th floor of what used to be the United Nations building in New York and stared at the reports covering his desk. 18 months had passed since the occupation began, and something was bothering him about the human territories. The numbers didn't add up the way they should, and his methodical nature demanded that he understand why. He had ordered a comprehensive population census 3 weeks ago, the first thorough examination of all the conquered human worlds. His survey teams had been working around the clock, counting buildings, scanning facilities, and documenting everything they found. The preliminary results were confusing, and Keth Var was a creature who did not like confusion. The humans had left behind a functioning civilization with advanced technology, detailed records, and impressive infrastructure. Their cities were marvels of engineering. Their orbital stations were sophisticated, and their industrial complexes were more efficient than anything the Zephyrians had built. Yet something felt wrong about the whole situation, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Lieutenant Ben Foster watched the alien survey teams through his telescope from his hiding place in the asteroid belt and felt his excitement growing. After 18 months of patient observation, the Zephyrians were finally starting to ask the right questions. His encrypted reports to Admiral Williams carried new urgency as he documented their growing confusion and frustration. The aliens were counting empty buildings, scanning vacant facilities, and slowly discovering that human space was much less populated than it should have been. They found residential areas designed for millions of people, but showing signs of occupancy by only thousands. They discovered industrial complexes capable of producing vast quantities of goods, but operating at minimal capacity. Dr. Tony Blake was humanity's leading expert on Zephyrian culture and psychology, and he had been waiting for this moment for over a year. From his mobile laboratory aboard the research ship Cultural Study, he briefed the fleet commanders about what would happen next. When the aliens finally understood the truth, they would panic, because the Zephyrian mind could not handle being deceived on such a massive scale. The Zephyrians valued control and predictability above all else. Their entire society was built on careful planning, methodical execution, and absolute certainty about the outcome of their actions. They had spent 3 years preparing for the conquest of human space, studying human behavior, and calculating exactly how to manage their new subjects. The idea that they might have been systematically deceived was something their psychology could barely process. Tony's research had identified the key weakness in Zephyrian thinking. They assumed that other species would behave according to the same logical patterns that governed their own society. When they conquered a territory, the conquered people either fought back immediately or submitted completely. The concept of a strategic retreat followed by a coordinated deception was outside their understanding of how intelligent species behaved. The revelation came during a routine inspection of a manufacturing complex in Detroit. Zephyrian Inspector Vexnor was examining the automated systems that kept the facility running when he noticed something that made him stop and look more carefully. The machines were maintaining themselves, but they weren't designed to do that forever. They had built-in expiration dates, subtle programming that would cause them to gradually fail over time. Vexnor called for a technical team to examine the systems more closely. What they found was a masterpiece of engineering deception. Every human facility, every automated system, every piece of infrastructure had been programmed with the same hidden feature. They would continue working normally for a specific period of time, then begin to degrade in ways that looked natural, but happened much too quickly to be coincidental. Ben Foster watched through his instruments as the truth spread through the Zephyrian command structure like a virus. Emergency meetings were called, survey teams were deployed to double-check previous reports, and technical experts were brought in to examine human systems that had previously been taken for granted. The aliens were beginning to understand that they had been living in an elaborate trap for over a year. Admiral Kate Williams received Ben's reports aboard her flagship Human Resolve and smiled grimly as she read about the alien discovery. The fleet had reached the Kepler sector 6 months ago and was already well established in their new home. Construction of permanent colonies was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the military buildup was nearly complete. Phase 2 of operation. Quiet Storm was ready to begin. Commander Jake Harrison was overseeing the final preparations aboard New Dawn when the order came through. Every ship in the fleet received the same message at the same time, transmitted on a frequency that would be completely undetectable to Zephyrian sensors. After 18 months of patient waiting, humanity was finally ready to spring the next part of their trap. Dr. Lisa Carter was in her laboratory running final diagnostics on the shutdown protocols when the confirmation signal arrived. Chief Engineer Carlos Santos had spent the last year perfecting the system that would simultaneously disable every human-built facility in occupied space. It had taken 5 years to develop the technology and 18 months to test it, but now they were ready to show the Zephyrians what humans could really do when they put their minds to it. The shutdown wouldn't be violent or obvious. Human systems would simply begin to fail in ways that looked natural, but happened far too quickly to be stopped. Power grids would fluctuate and die, water treatment plants would malfunction, transportation networks would shut down, and communication. Satellites would drift out of alignment. The aliens would watch their prize conquest transform into an uninhabitable wasteland over the course of 72 hours. Tony Blake had predicted that the Zephyrians would react with confusion first, then anger, then fear as they realized the scope of what humans had done to them. A species that valued control would be terrified by the demonstration that they had never been in control at all. They would understand that humanity had been playing a game the aliens didn't even know existed. Ben Foster prepared his equipment for the most important observation mission of his career. In less than 24 hours, he would witness the moment when the Zephyrian occupation of human space collapsed completely. The aliens who had congratulated themselves on their bloodless conquest were about to learn that there was no such thing as a bloodless victory over a species smart enough to plan 3 moves ahead. The trap was set, the trigger was ready, and humanity was about to teach the galaxy what happened when you underestimated the most dangerous species in known space. Admiral Kate Williams stood in the command center of her flagship Human Resolve and looked at the chronometer counting down to 0. In 30 seconds, she would give the order that would change everything. The fleet had traveled for over a year. To reach their new home, spent months building their strength, and waited patiently for exactly the right moment. That moment had finally arrived. At precisely 1430 hours Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday, Kate spoke the words that launched Phase 2 of Operation Quiet Storm. Her voice carried across the fleet communication network to every ship, every station, and every human settlement in the Kepler sector. The order was simple and had been rehearsed 1,000 times, but it still sent chills down her spine when she said it. The signal traveled at the speed of light back toward Earth and the occupied human territories. Hidden transmitters that had been placed years ago received the coded message and began executing programs that had been waiting dormant in every human-built system across 47 star systems. What happened next was the most perfectly coordinated act of sabotage in galactic history. Chief Engineer Carlos Santos had spent 5 years developing the shutdown protocols, and his masterpiece was about to be unveiled. Every human city, every orbital platform, every industrial complex, Every transportation network and every communication system began to fail at exactly the same moment. Not catastrophically, not obviously, just a gradual and irreversible decline that looked like natural breakdown, but happened far too quickly to be anything but deliberate. Lieutenant Ben Foster watched from his hiding place in the asteroid belt as the lights began going out across Earth. The first sign was a power fluctuation in the North American electrical grid that caused streetlights to flicker in major cities. Then the European grid showed similar problems, followed by Asia, Australia, and every other populated continent. Within 2 hours, entire regions were losing power in a cascade failure that looked completely natural. The Zephyrian response was exactly what Dr. Tony Blake had predicted. Administrator Keth Varr issued emergency orders for repair teams to investigate the power failures, but the aliens had no idea how to fix human electrical systems. Their own technology was completely different, designed around principles that didn't apply to human engineering. They could identify the problems, but couldn't solve them. Water treatment plants began shutting down 6 hours after the power grid. Failures started. The systems that cleaned and distributed water to human cities required constant maintenance and precise chemical balances that the Zephyrians didn't understand. Emergency reserves lasted for another 12 hours before major population centers started experiencing water shortages that forced the aliens to evacuate their administrative personnel. Transportation networks failed next as traffic control systems stopped responding. Subway trains lost power, and automated guidance systems for aircraft began giving incorrect information. The Zephyrians had been using human transportation to move between their facilities, and suddenly they found themselves stranded in cities that were becoming more dangerous by the hour. Ben Foster transmitted continuous reports back to the fleet as he watched the occupation force struggle with problems they couldn't solve. Zephyrian ships launched emergency evacuations from orbital stations as life support systems began failing. Ground-based facilities lost communication with their command centers as satellites drifted out of position and communication arrays stopped functioning. The most devastating failure came on the second day when the industrial complexes that manufactured spare parts and replacement equipment shut down completely. The Zephyrians realized that they couldn't fix the failing systems because they couldn't produce the components needed for repairs. Human manufacturing was integrated in ways the aliens had never understood, with each facility depending on dozens of others for raw materials, processed components, and specialized tools. Lieutenant Commander Nancy Wright led a squadron of reconnaissance drones from the stealth carrier Hidden Strike as they approached the edge of human space to observe the alien evacuation. Her sensors showed Zephyrian ships, fleeing from human worlds in complete disorder, abandoning facilities that had taken them 3 years to establish. The careful, methodical species that had conquered human space was now running away as fast as their ships could carry them. Carlos Santos monitored the shutdown progress from his engineering station and felt satisfaction as each system reported successful termination. The orbital platforms around Earth were the last to fail because they had the most robust backup systems, but even they succumbed to the cascade failures that had been built into every component. By the end of the third day, human space was completely uninhabitable by any species that didn't understand human technology. Admiral Williams received reports from observers throughout the former human territories confirming that the Zephyrian evacuation was complete. The aliens hadn't just abandoned their conquest, they had fled in panic, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry. More importantly, they had left behind detailed records of their own technology, military capabilities, and strategic plans that would be invaluable when humanity returned. Dr. Amy Rodriguez analyzed the psychological impact of the shutdown on Zephyrian leadership from her laboratory aboard New Horizon. The aliens had built their entire occupation on the assumption that they controlled human space, but the systematic failure of every human system had shattered that illusion completely. They now understood that humans had never been conquered, only temporarily displaced. The fear factor was crucial to humanity's long-term strategy. The Zephyrians would tell other species about what had happened, spreading word throughout the galaxy that humans were not a primitive species to be easily conquered. Any future aggressor would have to consider the possibility that humanity might have prepared similar surprises for anyone foolish enough to attack them. Ben Foster watched the last Zephyrian transport leave Earth's orbit and felt a surge of pride in what his species had accomplished. They had turned defeat into victory, transformed occupation into intelligence gathering, and converted exile into strategic advantage. The aliens who had thought they were conquering humanity had actually been teaching them about galactic politics, alien technology, and the weaknesses of species that relied too heavily on conventional thinking. As the final alien ship disappeared from his sensors, Ben began preparing for the next phase of his mission. Soon he would guide the returning human fleet to their homeworld and help them reclaim everything the Zephyrians had abandoned in their hasty retreat. Captain Pete Rodriguez guided his shuttle Second Chance through Earth's atmosphere and felt his heart racing as familiar landmarks came into view below. 2 years and 8 months had passed since humanity had silently departed from their homeworld, and now they were coming home to find it exactly as they had planned. Empty, damaged, but salvageable, and most importantly, completely free of alien occupation. The landing pad at the former Zephyrian Command Center in Geneva was littered with debris from the hasty alien evacuation, but Pete's instruments showed it was safe for touchdown. As the shuttle settled onto the concrete surface, he could see the abandoned alien equipment scattered around the facility like toys left behind by children who had run away in fear. Admiral Kate Williams stepped off the shuttle and breathed Earth, air for the first time in over 2 years. The smell was different somehow, carrying traces of ozone and metal that hadn't been there before the occupation. The silence was profound after months of living aboard crowded ships where the sound of engines and life support systems never stopped. Earth felt empty but peaceful, like a house waiting for its family to return. Dr. Sarah Johnson led the first restoration team into the abandoned Zephyrian headquarters and immediately began documenting what the aliens had left behind. Her job was to catalog everything useful and begin implementing the rebuilding protocols that had been planned alongside the original evacuation. What she found exceeded her wildest expectations for intelligence gathering and strategic advantage. The Zephyrians had been so terrified by the systematic failure of human systems that they had abandoned everything except their personal belongings and essential ship supplies. The command center contained detailed maps of their empire, complete records of their military capabilities, technical specifications for their weapons and ships, and most valuable of all, the locations and defensive capabilities of every Zephyrian world within 50 light-years of Earth. Commander Jake Harrison supervised the deployment of repair teams across North America as the restoration effort began in earnest. The shutdown protocols had been designed to disable human systems without causing permanent damage, and most infrastructure could be restored within weeks once the lockout programs were removed. The real challenge was upgrading everything with improvements developed during the exile years. The children who had spent over 2 years aboard the fleet ships were amazed by the open spaces and blue skies of their home world. 10-year-old Kevin Parker ran across a field outside Denver and laughed with joy at having unlimited room to move for the first time he could remember. His father, Steve, watched from nearby and smiled as he realized that the next generation would grow up in a world that was stronger and more united than the one they had been forced to leave. Lieutenant Ben Foster finally emerged from his hiding place in the asteroid belt and docked his stealth ship, Silent Observer, at the restored Luna station. His 18 months of solitary surveillance were over, but his reports had been crucial to the success of the entire operation. The intelligence he had gathered about Zephyrian behavior and capabilities was now being used to plan humanity's expansion beyond their original territories. Dr. Amy Rodriguez established her new laboratory in the ruins of the Zephyrian Research facility at Oxford University and began studying the alien technology that had been abandoned there. The devices were more advanced than human equivalents in some ways, but surprisingly primitive in others. The Zephyrians had focused on reliability and simplicity at the expense of flexibility and adaptability. Within 6 months of the return, human civilization was not only restored, but significantly improved. The unity and cooperation that had made the evacuation possible continued during the rebuilding process. Cities were redesigned with better infrastructure, industrial complexes were upgraded with new technologies developed during the exile, and orbital facilities were expanded beyond their original capacity. Maria Parker coordinated resource distribution between the returning colony ships and the restoration teams on Earth with the same efficiency she had shown during the fleet journey. Her experience managing complex logistics under difficult conditions made her invaluable in organizing the massive effort required to rebuild an entire interstellar civilization in record time. The most important discovery came when Dr. Johnson's team found the Zephyrian strategic database in the Geneva Command Center. The aliens had been preparing for wars with 3 other species and had detailed plans for conquering systems throughout their region of the galaxy. They had also been terrified of 2 powerful civilizations that they considered too dangerous to attack directly. Ambassador Frank Cooper addressed the newly reformed United Nations Assembly in New York 6 months after the return began. Representatives from every human world and colony attended the session, either in person or through quantum communication links. His speech marked the official end of the exile period and the beginning of humanity's new role in galactic politics. Frank explained how the Zephyrian occupation had taught humanity valuable lessons about unity, patience, and the power of strategic thinking over immediate action. The aliens had unknowingly given humans time to perfect technologies that had been in development for decades, unify their scattered colonies under single leadership, and develop tactics for dealing with hostile alien species. The former Zephyrian territories were now open for human exploration and colonization. The aliens had fled so quickly that they had left behind mining operations, research stations, and even some populated worlds that were now defenseless. Humanity found itself in possession of an empire twice the size of their original space without having to fight a single battle. Captain Roy Mitchell commanded one of the exploration fleets that ventured into former Zephyrian space to claim the abandoned systems. His ships carried scientists, engineers, and colonists who would establish human presence in regions that had never seen human visitors before. The aliens had inadvertently provided humanity with detailed maps showing the locations of every valuable resource and strategic position in their former territory. The story concluded with humanity's transformation from a conquered species to a major galactic power in less than 3 years. The silent departure that had seemed like defeat had become the loudest statement any species had ever made about the dangers of underestimating human creativity and determination. The Zephyrians had learned too late that conquering human space was easy, but understanding humans was impossible. As human ships explored the galaxy beyond their original borders, one lesson echoed through every encounter with alien species. The race that could orchestrate a 3-year deception without making a single sound was not a species to be conquered, controlled, or underestimated. Humanity had announced their arrival on the galactic stage not with weapons or threats, but with the most devastating display of strategic patience the galaxy had ever witnessed.